what they've done with it, although I miss my old bishops who used to hang on the wall, who looked down sternly on us to make sure we were doing the right thing. But I guess they're looking down sternly on us anyway, so we're okay with that. I'm happy to be here. My wife Jill could not be here. She got the duty this weekend to keep one of our grandchildren, and it was a long weekend, and we just couldn't see bringing her. She's 8, but still, I think this would have been too much for her. 4 days. And she's not that interested in Swedenborg science at this point, so I'm working on that. I'm happy to have been invited to talk about this. I wanted to start by just saying that I've been the president of the Swedenborg Scientific Association for a while. I don't know how long, but quite a while. And it was always a very important part of what I did here. When I first came here, I was introduced to it by a couple of people who probably had a lot to do with keeping it strong over the years. And 2 people come to mind, although it's been in place for 110 years. But there are 2 people that come to my mind that have actually put it on the map and kept it there. And one is Charlie Cole. I think everybody remembers him. And he did much to support the SSA, but also to support the philosophy behind it. Why do we need it? Why do we want it? And I know he infected me very early when I came here, and with this love of Swedenborg science. And then there's a rascal named Erland Brock around here somewhere who has also, over the years, been pretty much, at times, the sole prime mover of the SSA, and he never wants credit for anything, but too late, I've already done it. And so those 2 men have done a lot. But I just want to talk first about the topic Swedenborg science, but I want to start with the SSA because of all we're the only organization in the world, really, whose primary purpose and only purpose is to keep the scientific works in print. And that used to be very difficult because printing used to be a difficult thing to do. But now we have gone into an era of online, on-demand printing, and it has made things so much easier that it actually makes us look good, doesn't it? We can just keep the books in print and say, we've done this, when in fact it's gotten a lot easier over the years than the old process of printing books. So the SSA, as far as we know, started in around 1898 in Chicago, and it was a little group of people, and they called themselves the Principia Club. And they met there in Chicago, and they were people from the Chicago New Church, and they got together to read and discuss Swedenborg's scientific works. And they weren't the first people, but they came together as a group and promoted this as an organized effort. And one noteworthy person who came from Chicago and was an original member of the Principia Club was a lady named Lillian Beekman, who did much towards promoting the scientific works. And so our history goes way back. Our charter is very simple. It is to keep the scientific works in print. Scientific and philosophical, although it's kind of hard to draw the line between those. And then they've been relegated to a really strange category called pre-theological, which makes them seem different in some way. And so call them what you will. We keep those books in print, and then we encourage scholarship in those books, and we encourage publishing in that line. So we do those things too. Oh, what I've given you is 2 handouts. One of them is just my notes that I'm using here. At the last minute, I thought, well, I'll just give them my notes, and then they can follow me, and I can follow me, and we can all do okay. There, in my mind, is a myth of 2 Swedenborgs. One is Swedenborg the scientist, who started out as a young, precocious scientist in the age of reason, and didn't want to follow his father in theology, who could follow the bishop in the Lutheran Church. He didn't want to do that. His path was science. And he starts out and he does noteworthy work for years in science. That's Swedenborg the scientist. And then midlife, around age 56, he has this spiritual crisis, we call it. And then what emerges from this is Swedenborg the theologian. So we have 2 Swedenborgs. And we can read his science books, and then put those away, and then we read the theological works, which we all do, which are the basis for the Church of the New Jerusalem. I've always thought that was a little bit harsh because Swedenborg was only one guy, and he started out as a young, precocious scientist, and he worked his program through into his middle age, reached a point where he did have a spiritual crisis, and then he emerges as a man doing work differently, using completely different language and completely different methods, and yet the questions he asks are the same as far as he's concerned. He still wants to know the same thing. So what does he want to know? First of all, in one of his earliest science books, called On Tribulations, he wants to know how action at a distance works. How can something here, talking about human body, how can something here cause something down here to do something? He's interested in this idea of remote action. And in Tribulations, which is a very early book, 1719, and it's incomplete, we only have part of what he wrote. He's unbelievably mature in his approach to the problem. The tribulations were vibrations, and they were essentially instantaneous in getting an action here causing an action there. So one of his first ideas, the first questions was, how does action at a distance happen in the body? But he's always looking bigger than that. How about in the whole world? So he writes that little book. We can trace this all the way to the end point and find his doctrine of correspondences there, which we don't find in Tribulations, but we find it in Germ, right there in that little book. It's amazing. Also in that book, he sets up a plan for describing all of existence, all of the material world, in some kind of a three-dimensional structural scheme. And he says everything works according to a three-dimensional, call it a matrix. That's a good word we use today. He didn't have that word, but he would have used it. And he says, he calls it the continuum. And this word shows up early in his writings, 1734 in the Infinite and the Final Cause of Creation. He used this term continuum. And it just means parts that are independent and yet adjacent, communicate with one another, back and forth, and then in a whole, if you had an infinite number of parts, they're all in communication, but the continuum allows an orderly exchange of data, an orderly exchange of information. If everybody in this room talked at once, nothing would happen. But if you talked to him and he talked to her and he talked to Halfton and Halfton talked to someone else, then there would be an orderly exchange of information through this room, and that's what he saw as his continuum. But he saw it everywhere. He saw it in the human body down to its smallest pieces, and he saw it in the universe as well. Because every principle of his applies at all levels. So he wanted to know action at a distance. He wanted to know about a three-dimensional structure to matter, and he called that the continuum. And he's going to use that continuum idea as he develops this formal doctrine of degrees and series, how things are connected. And they're connected in three dimensions. And again, I think what we gain from this is orderly exchange of information, up, down, sideways. Instead of chaos, we have order. And if you know how human bodies work, it has to work in an orderly manner or it just melts down. So he also, very early on in his scientific work, wanted to know how, since he assumed from day one that spirit comes into nature and that nature and spirit were one, he wanted to know how that worked. Now, many people before him had assumed that spirit came into nature and flowed in and somehow supported nature, somehow maybe created nature. That was not a new idea with him. But what was new with him is he was so audacious and so brainy that he said, I'm just going to figure out how it works. I'm going to actually tell you how it works. Well, it's a hard job. But he started in at what we call influx. And this then, over time, becomes not a transition point, but a series. He finally figures out that influx comes by steps. And once he got over that, he was on his way. Because influx is not a single step. He said that wouldn't work. But it will work in a series of steps. Each step less spiritual, but less divine and more natural. Less divine and more natural. And he was onto that idea pretty early. And that will eventually become, for me, the most difficult doctrine of his to comprehend, called the doctrine of forms. Because forms is where he really explains how one of these levels then gives rise to another level, but each level has its own behavior. Each level responds to things in its own way. So he comes up with that. That'll eventually, I think, mature as his doctrine of forms. And like I say, we kind of walk over that doctrine some. We love to talk about degrees and series because we can understand that. We like to talk about other of his doctrines because they make sense. Correspondence is a tough one, but we love it because we think we understand it, and that's good enough. And but you get forms, and if you read that, it's just a small section in his last scientific book called The Fiber, and he just lays it in there. Kind of, well, it fits, but he just sort of adds it. And you read it, and you think, what was that? And you read it again, and you think, what was that? And you just keep reading, and finally, it'll begin to take form. And the reason it's so difficult to read is because of all of his writings that I've come upon, especially in the science, he's trying to be so precise. And you know how he can be precise with lots of words, but he doesn't want this misunderstood because he's explaining things that are very hard to comprehend, even for himself. But once you go over that a while, you realize that then is how influx works. And so we have that to work with. He, from day one, was interested in the question of how do minds and bodies interact? How do souls and bodies interact? Which is really just a lower level of the problem of how does spirit come into nature. Spirit, nature, mind, body, it's all the same to him. But he loved to look at human bodies as the laboratory for examining that. It's easier to examine human bodies than it is to examine the universe. So he says, let's find out how it works in people, and then maybe we can apply that back to how spirit comes into nature in general. So he's always working on two levels, pretty much. So he was interested in spiritual natural interaction. And again, he sees that as occurring across levels of order. And then, of course, he wants to know about the human mind. It's kind of the same thing, but he finds that the human mind, again, works according to levels. There are levels of the mind. And he's the first and only person I know that actually talks about the natural plane of the mind as a mind. We talk about it in medicine as the sensory nervous system. The sensory system it's just wires to us. And it's the wires that bring sensory data up to the brain, and then the brain does something with it. He calls that the natural mind. And I love that because it is a mind. It's self-regulating. It has its own centers in the cerebellum and elsewhere, even the spinal cord. It's a mind. And as a mind, it acts like a mind. We should be very careful with that mind. It's one of the most powerful minds that we have. It then uploads data to another level of the mind, which then uploads data to another level. And finally, we have that upper level that communicates with the divine. So he really wanted to understand human minds because he thought if we understood that, we could understand some of our own behavior and, again, answer the question of how God and we interact without us being God. That was very important because that was a philosophical problem that had to be solved. And then lastly, he's always talking about nature in the human form, not necessarily in those terms, but it's a given to him that nature, that spirit flows in and brings form. In the, what used to be called the economy of the animal kingdom, but we, at the SSA, decided it was time to change that title to dynamics of the soul's domain. The Latin title is just impossible to put into English, but it means the place where the soul lives and how it works. But that was too long of a title. So in that book, there's a chapter on embryology, the chicken and the egg, called it. And in that chapter, he tells us that what flows in to bring form to that embryo, that first little point, is formative substance. And I love that term. He uses it there. He uses it a few other places, but not a lot. But he drops it in there, and he says it's formative substance. What it is, it brings form. What form? Human form. But the chickens are humans. But their form is as human as a chicken can be. And so, because they're striving towards the human form, lower or different forms of life have less and less perfect expressions of human form. But even a worm, if you dissect, has essentially an arrangement very much like our own. They're striving to be humans, but the best they can do is worms. We strive to be in the perfect human form. The best we can do is this. You know what I mean? We're not perfect, but we strive towards it. And the natural world and this earth has raised up forms, you and me, that are as close to human as we can be. And we're far from the ideal. Believe me. If you saw me, you'd know it's far from the ideal. But inside me is a perfect human in this spiritual body. And I think that's a wonderful thought. And as I work with patients sometimes whose physical bodies are less than perfect in a big way, I tell them, you just wait. And it's all going to work at some point, all your parts. And so formative substance flows in from somewhere else and is in the human form. Now, when he goes into his theological works, he's still asking the same question. And you would think, how different? Well, now, human form is all. It's the maximus homo, it's the grand man. And everything is in human form, not just us, but the entire creation is in human form. And so he's still asking and working on the same question. So my premise is that he didn't change his question so much as he changed his method. And the Lord changed his method. He changed him forever from a kind of an audacious, almost too proud scientist to a very humble revelator, which is a good term. But nonetheless, it's the same brain percolating there. And what we have to remember is he brought his experience with him. See, the Arcana Celestia didn't just fall out of a tree on Swedenborg. He was working on that when he was 19 years old. He just didn't know it. And it's the same with all of us. As we get older, we do things differently. But if you think about it, we've all pretty much been working on the same program all the way through. And in his case, he had such a mental capacity, he was able to bring that together. But I don't see two Swedenborgs. I see Swedenborg in two definite modes, and I see him in transition at one point, and then I see him as a mature, quote, revelator, but what's he revealing? He's revealing the same stuff he was trying to reveal with science. And completely, of course, his interest is different now, but he's revealing it in different terms. So, he approached these same questions, I believe, from 2 points of view. First as a scientist, and that's kind of from down to up. We're starting here, we're going to work our way up to the spiritual reality. And then at some point, that really just doesn't work. He discovered that really, you can only climb the ladder so high. And so we have this theological approach where now, with the sake of mystical visions, he sees things from the top down. And when you can see things from the top down, they really make a lot more sense. But when you're seeing them from the top down, you're really not as interested in some of these details as you were before. You're completely in a different world. But it's the same questions. And I use the word mystical there, and sometimes people jump when you use that word. But mystical simply means an experience of the divine in its most simple terms. And I think we could say Swedenborg had lots of experiences of the divine, lots of experience of heaven and hell and the world of spirit, and spoke with the Lord himself. I would think that would qualify him as a mystic in those terms. He's not a woo-woo mystic. In fact, when people hear about Swedenborg and his speaking with people in other worlds, and especially in the book Heaven and Hell, they're looking for a woo-woo mystic. And by that I mean kind of I don't know what else to call him. But he's not that. Even in his most mystical experiences, he describes them like a scientist would, like a philosopher would. Almost not much emotion there. It's hard to find too much emotion in his theological work. You can find it in his scientific works. The prologue to the Animal Kingdom, which is now called The Soul's Domain, read that. There's a guy that's really excited. He's trying to get people pumped up. He's going to launch the ship, and we're going to go conquer the world. You don't find that so much in the writings. I think it's just because he's relaxed. He says, okay, I get it. This is my job. This is what I do. So the point is, yes, there are two modes of Swedenborg, but don't go looking for two Swedenborgs because you won't find them. I meant to mention, too, one reason that we have two Swedenborgs is an unfortunate quirk of history, and that is this lady, Lillian Beekman, came to town, was exceedingly intelligent. She read the scientific works as well as the theological works, and apparently just assimilated all of them. And she began to write, and she began to get other people interested in the scientific works. Her problem was she began to see a correlation between the science and the theology, and she wrote a lot about it. And people began to argue back and forth about the nature of this spiritual world, the nature of spiritual matter. Is it real substantial or is it ideal? Oh, philosophers throw chairs over that question. And it kind of came to a head in 1915, and I don't know, I wasn't there, but from reading what I can, there was kind of a lot of, they call it a disturbance, I hate to call it that, but there was something in the air. People were taking sides, and they weren't throwing chairs yet, but Bishop N.D. Pendleton apparently thought they might begin to throw chairs, and so in 1915, at a big meeting of the Council of Clergy, he said, okay, let's don't write any more papers on the scientific works for a while. Let's just shut this down. I don't think he really intended to do what happened, but for at least a decade, people were kind of proscribed from writing papers on the nature of spiritual matter and that kind of stuff. And so, yes, the disturbance died down, but I think there was an unfortunate fallout was don't look at these scientific works because somehow they might cause trouble. And so they just kind of got parked. But they're parked no more, and I think we're beyond that. We should be. It's been 100 years. But that does kind of, excuse me, it does kind of explain why we might have inherited an attitude of two Swedenborgs. Because there was a separation that was produced there by the authority of the bishop to quell a kind of a disturbance, kind of a period of time where he thought we needed to pay more attention to the theology and a little less attention to those theological, those scientific works. And then I think too, at that time in people's mind, the scientific works were kind of devalued in a way. Don't read those, read these, because this is the good stuff. Well, of course it's the good stuff. But just remember, Swedenborg came from where he came, and he began to write the Arcana Celestia only after a lot of preparation, and that really started in his childhood. And believe me, he was standing on all of that work he did before when he went into that other period. His language changes, he changes, and we're good with that. So, I also have a little handout here about, I made this years ago, and it's just his major scientific work. He did a lot of other stuff, but I didn't list everything. This is the books you would see on the shelf, and I want to talk about those in a minute. Just run through it, you can read it. There was a period of time, though, if you look at the Swedenborg Researcher's Manual, you'll find that from 1710, I think about it, he was born in 1688, so he's a very young man. And what does he do? For 2 years, he writes verses. I think as a young university guy and graduate, you had to prove yourself. And first, you had to prove yourself in your use of classical Latin. And so by writing verses, you did two things. You proved your ability to write in classical Latin, and you also kind of showed he wrote verses to people. And I think it didn't hurt to do that where he lived at that time. So it sort of ingratiated himself to people as a young scholar. So he did that for 2 years. And he wrote some poetry or verses, which we largely don't spend much time with. I never have, but they're there to read. But then from 1714 to 1718, as far as his publishing date, he was in an intensive period of interest in mechanical engineering. There's no interest apparent in biology, in anatomy, and soul-body interaction. He was so enamored with engineering because that's what was going on around him. That was the thing when he was that age, that he'd been hooked on with a lot of a guy named Polheim, who was the leading mechanical engineer, and he did lots of engineering things. And when you read them, that was the period of time where he invented an airplane, and he invented a machine gun, and a means for transporting ships across land to get them from one side of the fjord to the other, I don't know. But miraculous inventions, some of which, actually the airplane would fly if you could get enough engine in it. And it's interesting because aerodynamically, he really designed it pretty well. But of course, there was a guy with oars sitting there trying to fly it, and that wouldn't be enough energy. But he did some marvelous engineering. And then in 1719, who knows why, he writes this little book called On Tremulation. And he writes it in Swedish, not Latin. Who knows why? And we've lost most of it, but we just have what we have. And yet, here sits a lot of his work to come is all encapsulated in this one little fragment of a piece. That's where we find action at a distance. That's where we find the beginnings of the continuum. That's where we find, naturally, an inclination to know how, if this is nervous system, brain and mind and body, it's all there, sort of. And so in 1719, he's in business. And from 1719 through 1744, his business is chemistry, physics, and anatomy, and physiology. But this is what's important. This is his productive period in the science. His science, if you want to read it, is good. But there are a lot of factual problems with it. He's writing this in the 1700s. He's looking at references of authorities of his own day. He's doing his own work. And he's coming to conclusions on anatomy and physiology that are, in many cases, totally wrong. Who cares? He's a scientist working in his period. Of course, now, we scientists are right when what we are doing is right. The fact that all scientists throughout history have been wrong doesn't matter. We're right. So the fact that his science is not factually correct or up to date means nothing. What I look at in Swedenborg is his questions and then his method. He begins doing science with 2 feet, 1 foot in the spiritual world and 1 foot in the natural world, and he says the natural world is caused by the spiritual world. And he, as a young man, would have said, I don't know how that works, but this is my axiom from which I will now do science. So we call him a theistic scientist, and his model of a person as a theistic scientist is as good now as it ever was. In fact, it's excellent now, because we can do science in a very unabashed way from this spiritual natural perspective. So that was his axiom. And then his method was to always approach scientific problems from that point of view. How is it how is it a spiritual natural problem, and how does it work? Well, when you approach something from an axiom, the way things look is entirely different. If your axiom says there is no spirit, then when you look at nature, nature is dead. And so everything you see and describe and all the mechanisms you discover are going to fit that axiom or paradigm. If you start with another axiom that says all nature comes from spirit, then when you look at nature, you see that in some way and try to elucidate that. And your point of view is entirely different. That's why, well, as an aside, that's why education is so important. We've got to stick the right axioms in these little heads so that when they look at things, they see them in a particular way. You can everything you see is colored by what we believe at its base. And so his axiom was spirit, nature. So everything he said, everything he did kind of had something to do with that. So then lastly, then we have this period that we don't know what to do with it as well as we might. I just call it an intermediate period. 1745, he quits writing. He finishes this book called The Fiber. Very important book. This is where his doctrine of forms lives. Guess what? He didn't publish it. I don't know why, but it was something he did. He occasionally would write a book, finish it, and then lay it aside not to be published. But he laid it aside so that it didn't get lost. It's like, someone will get this later. He's in a hurry at this point. He's got a call. And so he leaves some stuff lying there, but he doesn't destroy it. It isn't lost. We found it and published it. So it's almost like he knew we would. I don't know. But this intermediate period comes after that. And we have some interesting books, and we've never really known what to do with them. Worship and Love of God. That's quite a book. And it's written in a very different style. And then he wrote this little thing called Messiah About to Come, which is really not much of a book of his own writing. It's scripture quotations. And then in the very end, he shows how these quotations have inspired him now to get into this work of theology. And he says the very last number says, I begin to write. Well, he did. What did he write? He wrote the Word Explained, we call it. It's a long series of books, and it is a explication of the Word. And he takes it a verse at a time, just like the Arcana Celestia, and tells you the spiritual sin. And so he writes this long thing. But what do we do with the Word Explained? We sell it at the bookstore, but as theologians, we kind of we avoid it because it's not the Arcana. But what is it? Well, it's an intermediate piece, and I think, and other people have said the same. He got this call to be a revelator, but it was a strange call. The Lord appears to him and says, you're going to do certain things, including expound the internal sense of the Word, and then takes off. And then here's Swedenborg saying, okay, I'll do that. So he waits around, nothing happens, and so he touches up his Greek. Of course, his Latin was perfect. He touched up his Greek. He learned his Hebrew. He began he annotated the entire Word. I think he's waiting around for his orders, because the Word Explained is that process. It's an old process. That process had been in place since people began looking at the Word. The Jewish mystics had been doing this for eons. You take it a verse at a time and you tell us what it means. Well, finally comes the Enlightenment, and then he goes, oh, okay, I get it. And so the Word Explained, he just shoves it over and says, okay, now we're going to start. So he does the Arcana Celestia, starting with Genesis 1, and he's off and running. And that book is entirely different from the Word Explained. Although the Word Explained has some good stuff in it. It just doesn't have that, it doesn't glow in the dark like the Arcana Celestia does. So, there's his theological period, and that goes, of course, to the end of his life. And his last book is his only book that really you could call a systematic theology, where he really lays it out by topics. Because as you know, from reading the writing, they're a little confusing. You want to find stuff, and he just goes here, he goes there. And finally, at the end of his life, he lays out a book that says, okay, you want to know my theology? Here it is. And it's an excellent book for that reason. I give it to people a lot, because that's his theology, and I can't get him to read the Arcana Celestia all. So that's what I do. Okay, so let's look at his scientific works. I'm a good teacher, which means I'm not going to read this to you. I give it to you. But we do have them in chronological order. And we have this book I've already spoken about on tremulation. It talks about chemistry, but when you read it, it's not like a chemistry book that Alan Bedford would use in the college. It has to do with matter. It has to do with matter at its lowest level, and little particles interacting with other little particles. Because after all, he's doing chemistry in 1721, kind of a new field. Then he kind of moves from there to the Principias. I just put them together there. They're just two different parts. This one is a huge work that kind of begins sounding like the chemistry. Little particles, little points, little things coming together. And what we have here, though, is the most remarkable treatment of matter coming into being that I've ever read, I think. And it sounds trite. It sounds like a cliche to say, in this book, you will find really what we're talking about now in quantum science, quantum physics, but man, it is. It's the darndest thing. He starts with a little point that comes from somewhere else, and it is from the divine because it moves. Not a new idea. A guy named Plato said that. But the fact is, there's a little point, and it comes across. It only has one dimension. It's hardly there, and it goes around in a circle. But the next thing you know, it hooks up with another one, and they aggregate into two, and then you get 1 and 2, and then they come together and form a little thing, and then they come together in different ways, and you get what he calls an active and a passive because of the way they act. And the next thing you know, that active and passive comes together, and kaboom, you have what he calls an elementary particle, and that's really like an atom. It's kind of like a hydrogen atom. It's got a neutron, it's got a proton, and an electron. And I forget the neutron, I don't know what they do. But there it is. But what he's brought us up to matter, but he's brought us through a series of steps totally hypothetical on his part. He certainly hasn't seen it. He doesn't have that CERN. I didn't do that.
My fault.
Okay, good. He doesn't have an atom smasher. He doesn't have anything. He just sits and thinks. So he comes up with this, and the Principia is a remarkable book. That's all I can say. So then he comes on. He says, "Okay, let's move on." 1734. He also writes this book called The Infinite and Final Cause of Creation, which is interesting because now he's trying to show the stepwise descent of spirit into nature and creating as it goes. So he's early on that. Only problem is he can't find a place where spirit and nature are not completely connected. So in that book, he's all the way down to the ground, and the ground is God. Just step down, which is bad because that makes me God, and you wouldn't want me God, I'm telling you. So he said, we got to have a gap there somewhere. He doesn't have that gap. We'll have that gap, but it takes a while. Then he heads off into the cerebrum, which is a long work on the human brain, and gets it all done and doesn't publish it, just puts it aside. He writes this other series of books that he starts called, we call it Dynamics of the Soul's Domain now. I think it is a good switch, but it's very confusing. Human anatomy, and he's looking for the soul in the body. How does it work? He uses the blood, he uses the lymph, he uses the spirituous fluid, which is kind of like cerebrospinal fluid, but it's got good stuff in it. And the good stuff is coming from a place in the cerebrum. And he's working out a system that's pretty elegant. But it's not definitive yet, but it's elegant. And then he writes the fiber, and I didn't get that out of place. And that's another part of the economy series. And he writes about the brain, the spinal cord, and all of that. He stops and writes rational psychology, which is about the human mind, because he's already talked about the human mind now, and he's telling us how it works. In that human mind, he says, he develops this idea of the doctrine of correspondence, but it's not spiritual natural so much as it is on the natural level. But he says, we need a book on that, so I'll write that next time, which he didn't do. And then he writes this little book called Organs of Generation, which is about the human reproductive system, but the best description of how the soul descends from the cerebral glands into the body is in that book. It's just amazing. I have it at home. I was reading on an airplane once, and the airplane was jumping around, and in my book it's underlined like a guy who's having some real difficulty. But I shouldn't have done it because I marked my book up pretty badly. But I couldn't quit underlining it, going, yes. So then he decides to write another book on the brain, like he didn't like the first one. It's different, but it's similar. And he didn't publish that either. And in that book on the brain, I won't even get into it, some marvelous stuff concerning the motion of the brain. The fact that the brain moves in an undulatory way, and then secondary to that motion, it pulls on the fascia that covers the brain and lines the cranium, and in fact moves the bones of the cranium, and voila, we have this thing called the cranial concept, which osteopathy has been on to since the 1920s, and got directly from Swedenborg. You'll find more about that from that guy over there today. But what a marvelous work. He explains the brain better than anyone ever had to his point. And then the five senses, and finally the soul's domain, which is another big series on the human body. And he talks about it this time not in terms of the fluids, but in terms of the systems. And the last chapter in the first volume of that book is the most remarkable description. He calls it the peritoneum, but it's the most remarkable description of the fascial or the fibrous matrix that encompasses every bit of us, from the most small part, even the DNA, all the way out to the covering of our body. And you can make much of that, but he nails it in that last chapter in the first volume. So that's a quick run through, but you can read this. I don't know how accurate it is, I just wrote it, but the fact is it'll give you kind of a play-by-play on what those books are all about. There is a continuity there. If you look at them at the bookstore, you think, they don't sound like they flow, but they do. And some of them he didn't publish. I don't know why. He could have, but he didn't. And so they're yours to have, and that's the main thing. So at the bottom of that little handout, there's a line of tribulations, to continuum, to degrees, to forms, to correspondence. Those little boxes are supposed to be arrows. It just kind of shows you that there's a flow to the development of his doctrine. And the flow has to do with necessity. He invents a doctrine, and then he says, okay, ooh, that causes new problems. So now here's this doctrine. Oh, now we got new problems. So I'll have another doctrine. So they come in a reasonable order. And they come in the reasonable order that any scientist would use. I discovered this, which then that creates new problems. It asks new questions. So then I got to answer those. And when I answer those, I say, there. Oh, now that I've answered them, I've asked new questions. That's the way science works. And so that's the way his doctrines came online. And so each one of them then serves the one before and asks questions for the one to come. And then put in line, they form a corpus or a program of research that we can use today. No, we're going to use his science today? No, we're going to use his methods today and some of what he taught. And by doing so, we can do some powerful things in science. And that's as simple as that. I'm working on a paper just now talking about evolution by natural selection, but driven by an internal conatus of human form. And why not? It's the way it seems to work. So, and I'm using all of his stuff to do that, especially the doctrine of forms. That's how it comes in. And so it's very powerful if we can learn to use it. So I'm about done. Of interest, the last book, the next to last book that Swedenborg wrote in 1769 is called Soul-Body Interaction, or Intercourse of the Soul and Body. Next to last book, 1769. What's it about? It's about causation. He talks about Leibniz, he talks about Descartes, Wolff, and he's right back to the start. He's right back to 1719 again, where he started out in the philosophical consideration of how things come into being. And he says that Leibniz was wrong. It's not pre-established harmony, it's co-established. And he's right back where he started. So Swedenborg he changes dramatically, but there he is at the end of his life, said, we're going back to this again. It's just so much fun. And I think that's an interesting commentary on whether there are two Swedenborgs. There are not. But there's Swedenborgs who did two things, obviously, and he did them very well. And then I want to mention, too, that the first good description of correspondence as a working doctrine of spiritual to natural, and then all it involves is the correspondence is between the use of the thing here and the use of the thing and what the thing does. Something in the spiritual world does something. This does something similar, therefore they correspond. But it took him forever to figure that out. I mean, it was a very difficult thing for him to come to. We don't find it in the scientific works. Correspondence is always on the same level. Things like arteries correspond to nerves and whatever. We find it in the Arcana, but it's already there. He's talking about the correspondence of human body with the grand man of heaven. And if you're following him from his science, it's like, whoa, wait a minute, where did that go? Because it's no longer, it's universal, whereas before it was particular. And if you think, and I remember doing this thinking, man, I'm having a trouble getting a grip on this correspondence. I found in a book his first description of it as a use corresponding to use. And I found it in the worship and love of God. Whoa, so is that Swedenborg the scientist talking, or is it Swedenborg the theologian, revelator talking, or I'll be darned, it lands in this intermediate period, that period that we don't know much about. And I think it's only fitting that it lands there, because that's his capstone doctrine. Correspondence is really where the rubber meets the road and everything comes to life. And so we find that excellent description in a book halfway in between. I think that's great that he put it there and not in either one of the others. So to me, that's a big deal. But anyway, I'm going to quit raving. But I think this transition of his was not a rebirth of a person into a new person. It was simply a refinement by the good pleasure of the Lord, who actually enlightened the man by spiritual visions, by actual speaking with the Lord himself, angel, spirit, personal experience in the spiritual world. He, of course, was refined. I don't believe he was reborn. Same old Swedenborg, 1769, arguing with Leibniz, arguing with Descartes. He's still there. And so I think his scientific works are well worth looking at as the foundation for his theological works. He would never have written them had he not been where he was in 1750, 1745. So there you are. Now, I took up a lot of time. Oh, Erlen was going to clap. Go ahead, Erlen. I like it. We have a little time for questions, and like I said, this is all just mainly me talking. I didn't do a lot of, which is out of my head, but I've read these forever. And there's one other person I'll give some credit to, and that's Reverend Alfred Ack. He got me into this in a big way. He had a course called Swedenborg's Philosophy that I took when I came here and went into the theological school. And he also revved me up in a big way by pointing me to the actual work. Charlie Cole got me revved up, and then Alfred Acton got me on to the reading, and I'll be eternally grateful to both of them for that. Yes, George.
Reuben, the work that you're working on sounds very exciting, and of course it's going to come at a time when there's an incredible tumult in the area of evolution of science and theism. And so, you know when that's going to come out?
Well, okay, that's George Gantz over there asking I'm working on a thing I told you about, a project concerning evolution. And he says it's going to come out at a time where there is a lot of tumult in the scientific world over evolution. And it will come out, I have a deadline of February 1, 2016. So if I don't do that, I'm dead. So it'll be done just before that, probably about an hour before. But it will come out, yes.
I'm just curious about, you have a scientific approach and a theological approach, and you have scientific 1719 to 1944.
Oh, that ought to be 1744.
Well, that's what I was wondering, whether you were thinking of it as an improvement on.
Just a mistake.
Okay.
When you do your own proofreading, it's dangerous. So, that's it. I would, anybody else? I'll tell you a little bit about this project, but very briefly. I was educated in a university where there were a couple of people who had studied. One older gentleman was an emeritus professor who had studied with a guy named Theodosius Dobzhansky. He is the patron saint of what's called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. He was an old man, and he was teaching this professor of mine when he was just a young pup. And then by the time I got to him, he was a very old man, still teaching, and I was a young pup. So I, by only one degree of separation, have learned from Theodosius Dobzhansky the elements of evolution, and as it is proclaimed by this Neo-Darwinian synthesis. In other words, the science of evolution as taught as doctrine in the scientific world. And in those days, this was prior to the days of the emergence of what was called creation science. Now, it was before that. And so, one of the main things we talked about in our seminars on evolution with this crusty old professor named A.P. Blair, and we talked about the holes in the theory. It's a great theory, but it doesn't hold water because it has some problems, and major structural problems, and we talked about those and how we might approach those problems. It was just like any other science. Quantum physics, they sit around and talk about problems with quantum physics. Yeah, but this doesn't match that, and if you do this, you can't do that. And that's what we did with evolution back then. Then the creation scientists came along, and as they got rolling, they adopted sort of an attitude that was aggressive and confrontive and often not very charitable attitude towards science. And I don't know why they did that, but they did that. And in doing so, scientists contracted back, and naturally, wouldn't you? And they contracted back, and they no longer began to talk about the problems with their theory, because after all, that would just be fuel for the fire. And then as it became more intense, they actually kind of circled the wagons a little bit, and now we have a situation where evolutionary scientists such as Richard Dawkins, he's the one we always throw the darts at, but there are plenty more. Evolutionary scientists are very reactive to anybody who says spirit of any kind. And there's a history for it. You almost can see it developing. Design scientists, people who have proposed intelligent design, they see as the same guys. They see them as design scientists in creation scientist clothing. It's not true, but they do see that. Design scientists were people who, scientists, and good ones some, who said, I'm looking at nature, looking at biology particularly, I'm finding systems that are so complex and so dependent on many parts working at once that your theory of natural selection simply could not have produced it. Well, and they're impressive in their laying out these examples, and then they're done. They do not offer any mechanism for how it might work. So it's like, your theory is bunk. And then you say, okay, well, how does it really work? And I'll say, I don't know. Well, that's no way to do science. It's okay to publish a paper saying this looks impossible, but at the same time, as a program, it died. That's why you don't hear much about ID anymore, because it just died. And what I'm trying to do, I'm not trying to save those guys, but what I'm trying to do is actually come up with a feasible, you might say, intellectually defensible position for how evolution could occur as driven by spirit. They picked the wrong word. Design's a bad word, the dumb word. It makes God look like assembling things behind the scenes, kind of magical thinking. But when you look at influx, the way it works, as human form, coming in at a level, at the lowest level of nature, where the quantum physicists tell us spooky stuff going on, that becomes more feasible. And that's kind of what I'm working on. And it's for a degree project, and I do have a deadline of, I've had to put it back twice, and they said this time, no more. So it'll come soon. I'm going to hope to publish it, and I don't know if it'll be any good or not, but I'm using Swedenborg's doctrines as applied to current science and thinking in that area to see if we can't kick the log jam a little bit and get things moving. So that's what I'm doing. And it'll be fun. I hope to finish it. But there you are. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest in Swedenborg science.